Hello there, so this is going to be a bit of an expansion on top of the previous video that was made titled Alternate Reality Spaces, and that video was really a primer for what we're going to be talking about quite a lot, certainly around the first half of this year, which is the human ability to form simulations of alternate realities and the profound effects that this ability has on us and what it can actually say about us as an organism. And what I want to do now is complement that by adding some examples of it in action, because I think that learning through examples is often a better way of explaining a theory, because they contribute the necessary context that makes these ideas really come alive in the mind. And so I want to begin today by looking at the ways that alternate reality spaces work in relation to conditions like autism. Now, autism is a phenomenon that's really taken on a life of its own once it came into contact with virtual space, which is somewhat fitting considering some of the things that we're going to say about it in this video. Autism has now become this kind of catch-all term to describe anything from an obsessive interest in media fandom to when somebody might exhibit an overindulgent concern for minutiae within a debate. As a descriptor, it has been selectively sampled and overextended in its application. However, even inside these new applications of the term, it does often associate to certain elements of truth within the condition. People with autism do sometimes foster bizarre interests in things that other people might not see as being that significant, and they can become overly preoccupied with unnecessary detail. So even though the public perception of autism has become contaminated through its contact with online space, the psychological measurement of it is still very much intact, and within that we can say much more confident things about it. With this video, this isn't going to be a detailed, thorough exposition of every single facet of the condition. What I want to do instead is cut through the fog of complexities and confusion that surrounds autism and really hone in on a particular aspect of it that supports our interest in alternate reality spaces. And that is the flight away from the external world and into the interior world of psychic interests. We're also going to talk about how this creates a disproportionate level of investment into one space over the other, and how this has some interesting parallels with the practice of shamanism in primitive societies. So with all that now being said, let's begin by saying something about this particular aspect of the condition. One of the things that really defines autism, and people who fall under the Asperger's category as well, is this difficulty in being able to process social dynamics. The autist may misinterpret body language, respond inappropriately to certain social cues, and have difficulty in translating things like emotional signaling, for example. All of the things that other people take for granted as part of their learned social vocabulary is a world of confusion to the autistic personality. And one of the understandable consequences of this is an intense anxiety around social situations. If you remember far back to the first time when you experienced swimming in a large swimming pool with a shallow end at one side and a much deeper end at the other, and that initial apprehension of confronting that proposition without the requisite ability to properly navigate through that element. I remember when I was at school and we first went swimming, and I've never had a problem with swimming whatsoever. I still swim to this day. I've always really loved the water, but I always remember there was this one young kid, and he really did not like it in there. It was incredibly difficult for him even to be in the shallow end of the pool where he could still be upright and his head was above water. Simply making contact with that element was really difficult for that child. And that's quite a good comparison for how the autist experiences the social element. It's like being on the water's edge and not being able to swim. And so due to the distress of the social anxiety that's caused, what we see this is this retreat away from the social world and a compensatory investment into non-social phenomena. And these could be material subjects or they could be introspective subjects. And all of this brings about with it some very interesting consequences. I've heard it said before by some people that men are more autistic than women because they show a higher proclivity to invest into the world of things as opposed to the world of people. This is obviously one of those expanded applications of the term autism again, but still it's somewhat appropriate because the autistic individual does display a preferential investment into non-human systems. And this is what lends the higher functioning autistic mind its pronounced ability in certain fields such as mathematics, for example. Numbers exist in an abstracted realm that is removed from all social concern, and that makes for a much more intuitive element for the autistic mind to swim in, so to speak. So can you see, just from talking about some of these things, how this might translate into our ability to manufacture alternate reality spaces? Because despite their neurological abnormality, the autistic individual is still a fully anatomically modern human and possesses the same ability as we do to simulate. So how could the condition of autism within an individual affect this ability? Well, the first thing to say is that an alternate reality space does not necessarily obey the norms of social dynamics, nor do they have to conform to normal natural convention either. It can simulate both of these things, but the world of introspection belongs to another family of interests that is abstracted away from the world that it simulates. And with regard to things like personal encounters, it apes the characteristics of an encounter while simultaneously being removed from the typical consequences of these encounters in the normal lived reality space. This makes the private realm of introspection far more reassuring for those with social anxiety because the private realm does not carry the same demands and awkward tensions that stem from interacting with a flesh and blood human being. And what's more, thoughts can be easily modulated into new variations of things. Machines, monuments, flora and fauna, new worlds, political systems, cultural systems, belief systems, anything alternate to the organic world can be privately simulated within the mind. Therefore, we can live out, so to speak, imaginative occurrences within that analog space that satisfies any whim that we might desire. And what's more, it doesn't possess the same sting and stigma that we might find in ordinary human interactions. So the ability to simulate is a literal godsend for the autistic person because it means that they can acquire a sense of agency and imagine fulfillment within an area that naturally feels intuitive to them. The other side to this, though, is that it only further justifies a retreat from the external world, meaning that people who possess such conditions usually run the risk of becoming quite isolated and self-contained, as it were. This can especially come in handy, however, for people on the more higher functioning spectrums of the condition. A musician that I'm a big fan of, Gary Newman, for example, has Asperger's, and he says that that really comes in handy for when he's making his music as an artist because he has that ability to completely lock into what he's doing and blot out everything around him for very long periods of time. So being on his own in a studio kind of setting, working for those long periods of time isn't really, and away from people, away from social concern, isn't really that much of a bigger problem for him, and his condition isn't that debilitating that when he does actually need to interact with other human beings, though it might be somewhat nervous, it may be, invoke a certain anxiety within that individual. It's not as debilitating as it is for people with more intensified feelings of the condition, so to speak. So I think that we've built up enough of a solid foundation now to see how psychological conditions like autism can actually influence the effects of pre-existing human abilities, such as the ability to simulate. And what I want to do now is draw some comparisons between this condition and the practice of shamanism. So when we think about conditions like autism, do we immediately associate that to ideas like shamanism? Probably not, right? But there's actually more familiarity between these two things than you might imagine. Let's say, for simplicity's sake, that the practice of shamanism is predicated upon a belief that introspective conceptions of existence are equally as valid as material existence. In other words, the experience of dreams, hallucinations, and visions of experience acquired through altered states of consciousness have as much integrity to them as a tree, a rock, or any other kind of material phenomena. And the role of the shaman within primitive communities is to be singled out, to meet with those spaces and commune with them. They act as the mediators between the material world of phenomenological experience and the interior world of phenomenological experience. And they do this in order to bring back the specialized information that will reconcile the community's psychology to their cosmological conception of the environment, and also work into other specialized interests such as healing and medicine, for instance. So a shaman is quite the jack of all trades in that respect. They are mystics, psychoanalysts, botanists, and doctors all put into one person. It has been reasoned by some anthropologists that the shaman acts like a psychological regulator of the entire community. He communes with the introspective psychic material and puts it into a mythological language that the rest of the community can understand. And this works to placate the individual psyches of his fellow men and maintain the necessary psychological equilibrium of the community as a whole. But what we really have here in relation to our interests is an individual who has been noted with an aptitude for introspection, someone who we might frame in our contemporary language as being an introvert. An introvert spends more time in the world of interior forms than the external social world, and therefore possesses a potential capacity for a richer imaginative life and an ability to be more at home inside of themselves, so to speak. And there's something really interesting that happens in these primitive communities. When I first found out about this, I thought it was fascinating. What the shamans will do, and this still goes on in primitive societies that still exist in the Amazon, by the way, what these shamans will do is that they will carefully observe the new generation of youngsters coming into the world, and they will analyze their development from a distance. And what they do is they specifically look out for children who display signs of social anxiety, or children who appear to be a bit more quiet than the other kids. And what they will do is they will isolate those children and steal them away from their parents, and they will raise them to be shaman. And like I said, when I first found out about that, I thought it was absolutely fascinating, because it indicates, at least on a very intuitive level, an understanding that certain types of psychological disposition, personality dispositions, lend themselves better to the practice of shamanism, probably because there's, as I said before, more of a capacity for spending time within oneself, a more creative richness in the imagination, perhaps. But I found that very interesting nonetheless. And I want to play a bit of video material on our way out now in this video. This is taken from the clips of a really interesting documentary called The Horse Boy. And I'll leave a link to that documentary below if you do actually want to see the whole thing after this. And this is quite a long documentary about a family's incredible story with their son, who has autism, this young boy. And they've had a hell of a time, as you can imagine, with this young kid. They tried all kinds of different things, all kinds of different therapies to try to alleviate the suffering of his condition, and certainly their own suffering as well of having to deal with this young child. And in the end, they end up going on this huge adventure to Mongolia, of all places, which is the only country in the world where shamanism is actually the state religion. And they travel all the way to Mongolia to meet with these horsemen over there who have these shamans in there, and they see if it can do anything with it. And what actually proceeds in the documentary is quite fascinating, especially the child's responsiveness to animals and how they respond to him as an autistic boy compared to so-called neurotypical individuals. So yeah, I'll just play the video for you now.
Where did the baby go? Baby goat?
One more hippo.
I had been keeping Rowan away from horses because I thought he was unsafe around them. But one day, he ran away from me onto the property of my neighbour Stafford and ran right up to his old mare, a horse called Betsy. She didn't spook. Instead, her reaction was so gentle, so submissive, I realised immediately that he had some direct line to her. The moment I put Rowan on Betsy's back, he began to speak.
He's a nice horse.
This deep relaxation, it's such a rare thing for him. There's something going on between them that, even with all my years of dealing with horses, I just have never seen. It's this mystery, but it's a very beautiful mystery. Just like autism is a mystery. I couldn't help wondering, did I really have his best interest at heart here? Was I being a terrible father? I didn't know. Is he gonna whip me?
Yeah, a little bit. You cannot scream.
And then something happened. Something was released. Rowan began laughing, giggling, playing with the shamans. We were together again as a family. Clouds gathered. A cool wind got up, and the rains came. A very good sign, said the shamans. Thank you. After the last shaman had finished, Rowan turned to this small Mongolian boy who'd been there at the ceremony, and right out of the blue, hugged him and said, "Mongolian brother." He'd never done anything like this before.
Oh, I haven't licked the goats. No, I licked the goats. And
Rowan's relationship with animals is extraordinary. All these animals are incredibly tolerant of him. They let him do stuff that neurotypical kids often can't get away with. He picks them up, he chucks them around, and the cat won't scratch him, the goats just sort of go limp and let him do this. And we see this time and time again. He's got something with animals, and he's always been obsessed with animals.
So we saw there quite a dramatic change in the boy's behaviour, for one, being in this totally foreign country, which can be very problematic for people with autism because they often get locked into these chains of familiarity, familiar environments, familiar patterns, familiar habits, familiar people. And if that chain of familiarity is broken down, then they experience a meltdown. And you see this happen with this child several times, should you choose to actually view the entire documentary in its whole. I think it's clear from the video footage that I spliced together there that the ceremony did have some influential effect, both on the boy and especially on the parents. Did you notice the two activities that were going on there? The rhythmic drumming, for one, and the whipping with that small piece of rope. The drumming is fairly common in shamanic practices, especially in Mongolia, and this is an aid to help modulate human conscious states, primarily in the shamans themselves, actually. Repetitive action, especially produced by sound effects, affects the human physiology, which is to state specifically that it perturbates the human nervous system, and this results in the altered state of consciousness that the shaman requires to bridge that link between the physical world and the world of the spirits in his alternate reality space. Secondarily, this can also be used to create a hypnotic state in the minds of those around the shaman to tenderize their minds, so to speak, and to put everyone in the ritual into a state of mind that's more receptive to the agency of spirits, which to my mind means to say that it helps the chance of effective inner simulation. I do wonder if there were shamans in that group who were like the boy they were treating, somewhere on the autistic scale themselves. The other part of that as well was the whipping. This wasn't stated explicitly in the documentary, but this to my mind is clearly a preliminary purification rite, which is designed to drive out negative spiritual baggage that the partakers of the ritual might be carrying around with them. And purification is often a prerequisite to any major ritual activity, primitive or modern, and its reasoning lies on the simple assumption that impurity cannot deal effectively with divinity. Think of it like using a dirty knife to carve meat. You wash the knife before you treat the meat to avoid contamination. And a similar line is applied to ritual activity. The body is understood to be a vessel that can be easily contaminated. And so since the vessel is like an antenna that tunes into the frequency of the spiritual space, it must be purified to ensure a correct transmission, so to speak. I also think that these whipping activities might also play into the process of physiological conditioning. The nervous system is being modulated on one level through the effects of the rhythmic drumming, and then it's being hyperstimulated through these sharp, short bursts. And I think that this two-way process might have some purpose in the ritual ceremony, but that's just a hunch on my part. There've not been, to my mind, any major scientific tests made whilst these rituals have been performed on people. We also saw in the video footage the remarkable interaction that this boy had with animals. Did you see how relaxed they were around him and how much more at ease he was around them? They almost seemed to swarm around him at one point. Now, this could simply be put down to the animal's curiosity and coming from an understanding that this boy doesn't possess any serious threat to them. However, this doesn't account for their increased tolerance of autistic children and how they let him play around with them. This is an area that I think warrants some serious inquiry because it could potentially reveal to us much more about animal psychology than it yields to us about the autistic minds that got us to start inquiring into them. And on the subject of autism and animal psychology, Jordan Peterson's mentioned this a while ago. He was talking about a woman in the United States called Temple Grandin, who, interestingly enough, is also featured in this documentary as well. And she was born with severe autism, so severe, in fact, that when she was a child, she couldn't even learn the skills to speak properly, and her parents spent an awful lot of time and effort with her, getting her up to the point where she could actually speak. And amazingly, I mean, it's been an incredible journey like this, the people in this documentary, because Temple she's now a professor at some university in the United States now, so that's a really incredible metamorphosis from where she came from in her younger period of life. But also what makes Temple Grandin really interesting is that one of the things that she's done in her life is revolutionized the way that we treat livestock in farms and especially in slaughterhouses. Basically, she thinks, due to the nature of her condition, she thinks that she knows what it's like to think like an animal. And so she's visited these slaughterhouses across the United States and these farms, and she's walked around these places and she says, this needs to be changed, this needs to be obfuscated here, these adjustments need to be made, because of the fact that she thinks that she knows what it's like to be an animal. She has helped these people redesign the structure of their facilities to make it less anxious and uncomfortable for the animals as they're being processed through these facilities. And if you've got the time, watch Temple Grandin's incredible talk that she gave on the subject of visual thinking and animal psychology, and I'll also link to that in the field below. And hey, if you're an artist or know someone else who is, tell them to watch this video as well, because she really illustrates the power of non-verbal styles of thinking and how this can redefine the way that we receive art, for example. So, in conclusion then, we've seen how a flight from the tensions of the social world can yield augmented results in an individual's capacity for introspective activity, which increases the likelihood for introspective simulation to occur and alternative styles of thinking to be born from them. We've also compared this against the practice of shamanism, whose members, quite similarly to the autistic individual, swims in the element of interior abstractions and employs them within their own cosmological arena, which is the product of an alternate reality space. Alright then, so I think with that we're going to draw things to a close. I really didn't want to ramble on too much in this video about this topic. I really wanted to set this up as a mini exemplar of what I already stated in my previous video, alternate reality spaces. And I think that autism as a condition, a psychological condition, is very interesting on its own. But when you also run it in parallel to certain other phenomena such as shamanism and also animal psychology, I think it becomes even more interesting, don't you think? So that's what we're going to say for this one. The next video after this is again going to be a continuum of this, and I'm really, really looking forward to making that one. That's not going to be about autism, that's going to be on schizoid personality types, and I've wanted to talk about this personality type for a very long time, and again we're going to talk about it in relation to alternate reality spaces. Can't wait to make that one. I'm more enthusiastic about making that one than I was making this one, yeah, really looking forward to that. Okay then, so thanks very much for watching again, and yeah, as usual, take care, and I'll see you again.